Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Ray. I'm a penguins and flying birds keeper at London Zoo, and today I'm going to be telling you a bit about the changes we've made regarding weight loss and body condition in our colony of Humboldt penguins. So just a bit about the colony that we're working with here at London Zoo. So we are currently housing 79 Humboldt penguins. Originally, our habitat opened in 2011, the one we're working in now, Penguin Beach. It is a very large habitat, which does pose its own struggles in itself. So it's a 1,200 square meter habitat with a 450,000 liter saltwater pool. We do have a mix of both parent and either fully or partially hand-reared penguins, but we do have a wide age range, which is great. So from 5 months, which is this year's chicks, of which we have 17, to 23 years old and a few months for our oldest penguins. So I'm sure this is familiar to a lot of you, but this body condition scoring guide by Clements and Sanchez is very beneficial, very helpful. It's basically one of the only body condition scoring charts for banded penguins. However, it is only a 5 point scale, and in our collection with our veterinary department, we do prefer to use a 9 point scale. It just gives us a little bit more leeway to give our animals the best and most objective and most accurate way of scoring their body condition. So we have created our own 9 point scale to use instead. It's not much different. It obviously just gives us the extra points in between so we can make sure we're offering the most accurate and looking at changes in a more minute way. However, we do know that with penguins, seasonality is extremely important to their yearly life cycle. So for them, we are expecting higher body condition scoring in both the molting and the breeding seasons when they're rearing their chicks. But we would overall expect lower body condition scores in the foraging and mating seasons when they're not needing to supply themselves with as much calories, as much nutrition as they would when they're rearing chicks or preparing for their annual molt. So, why did we need to change? Why did we bring this up as far as reducing weight and reducing body condition score? Well, in our colony, the main reason that it came up was because we did have a lot of individuals presenting with lameness and changes in their musculoskeletal system. So, in our colony, any sort of changes for arthritis related things are going to be through lameness. However, we also had many historically lame animals in our colony that perhaps we could improve the monitoring and welfare of. However, the bonus to this is that when animals were euthanized for any sort of unmanageable arthritic changes and musculoskeletal changes, they generally were coming back as overconditioned on the postmortem from our pathology department. So we found one thing that we can do overall to improve the welfare of those animals is to conduct better monitoring. That was something that was very much in our hands of things we could do more of, so we decided that's a great way to start. So we introduced a few different things. We introduced weekly mobility rounds, where animals that are presenting with lameness can be monitored weekly with our team and the veterinary department. We can score them and see if there's changes over time, either with the introduction of medication or the removal of medication. We also created clear outcome guidelines for animals on medication. So there's a clear step system of at what point we can add medication, remove medication, or ultimately make a decision for euthanasia if necessary. But we also introduced Weight Watchers, which we're very, very proud of because that was more of a every other week monitoring session with our veterinary department and our team again, where we're looking at animals that are overconditioned and we can monitor them again over time, however, not as quickly because we know body condition doesn't change quickly, although they are small animals. So we introduced Weight Watchers as a way of monitoring our historically overconditioned animals and watching their changes over time. We also conducted body condition score training with our veterinary department and our evidence-based animal care team so that we could all ensure that we are aligned on what body condition scores look like in our colony and create a really outlined system. And we also added yearly general anesthetics and x-rays for our geriatric animals or anyone who has previously had mobility concerns so that we can monitor them over time versus only getting a snapshot image at a point where it's already too far gone. And instead we can watch changes over the time and see if the changes are becoming more significant. So when looking to change or influence the body condition and weight of our animals, feeding and diet is a very obvious place to start. So that is where we started. So we begun by proposing a change as far as the amount of fish per day. Historically, they've been fed ad lib throughout the year. However, now we would, outside of breeding and molting seasons, allow them a limited amount of fish per day. It's not too little. It's about 500 grams per animal per day. And working with our nutritionist and our veterinary team, decided that was an appropriate amount for the animals in our care. We also looked into transitioning to a lower fat content fish for the primary part of their diet, where they're currently being fed sprat. We looked into a few other options. However, with our logistics team looking at getting those in, we found that they were more expensive and less sustainable. So instead, we looked at providing a greater variety of fish, and able to influence seasonality as they would in the wild. So we're able to offer them a wider variety in the amount of options that they have. And then the most interesting part for us was auditing the actual number of feeds per day and the amount of people involved in those feeds. So when we conducted this audit, you can see on the left, they were being fed many, many times throughout the day. So it was about 14 feeds, give or take, and they were being fed little and often, and by a lot of different people. So with our engagement team, they would be fed either by our overnight experiences, they would be fed by our penguin experience, and they would be fed during the penguin talks. And on our retail team, they would be feeding them one of the times during the day as well as normal keeper feeds as well. So we reduced it greatly. We found that the quality of the amount of feeds, the amount of animals that were coming to the feeds was really diminished by the number of times they were being fed. So by reducing the amounts, you'd have more animals coming to every feed and to the feeds when they're actually hungry versus being able to wait 20 minutes for the next opportunity of a kilo or two. So the overall quality of the feeds is much better and much more important than the quantity of the amount of feeds per day. So, with changing the feeds and reducing the number of feeds per day, we also changed the amount of feeds on land per day. So, they were being fed about 50% of their daily diet on the beach, either through a recall training or through feeding on the nest or just generally feeding on the beach if they weren't influenced to come into the water. However, we wanted to influence them to come into the water. We wanted to drive that. So, we did need to habituate them over time from being fed on land to being fed in the pool. We didn't want them to just go hungry and eventually make their way in. Instead, we were going to do it over time, just like you would do any diet transition. So we did about 25% at a time over several weeks until they were receiving now, and for the last about year, only about 10% or less than 10% of their daily diet is fed on land, and of which it is only for training. But with this, we also did have some concerns about our penguin parents. Historically, we have fed on the nests during breeding season, so we wanted to see if our penguin parents were still eating enough and still being cooperative. So we did use ZooMonitor and our lovely master's students to help us with this study, where we were using ZooMonitor to assess the cooperation in feeding and breeding pairs. So we were able to mark breeding pairs and parents as present or not present at any of the feeds, so either the training or the water feeds. And from there, generally assume until both parents were feeding off the nest that one parent would be eating in the water, the other would be back on the nest with the chicks. So we're able to get relatively accurate information of how often they're feeding and also how often that they are swapping. And what we found from this is that our penguin parents are still wonderfully cooperative. They are doing a wonderful job. So you can see here of the cooperation score, one being the highest, generally are going to have a range of 0.89 on the cooperation. So that's excellent. They're doing a wonderful job of splitting duties, swapping appropriately, and rearing their own chicks without us influencing or providing their fish to them. They're still having to perform natural behaviors of swapping, leaving the nest, coming to eat, and returning to feed the chicks. But we obviously looking at diet, very obvious. However, when we think of losing weight, we think of diet and exercise. So, how do we influence our penguins to move? How do we encourage that? Because we don't just want to reduce diet, we want to do a holistic change. So, training for us was the really great opportunity for us to create some really cool moments and really cool experiences for our animals and for our visitors too, to show some really cool natural behaviors. So when looking at training and enrichment for exercise, we first began by doing a behavior workflow with our evidence-based animal care team on penguin feeding behavior. So what we do is we're looking at wild penguins and wild penguin behavior to look at the pre, during, and post behaviors of penguins feeding in the wild. And some of the key behaviors we took from that we wanted to introduce into our colony and encourage in our colony was high-speed swimming and porpoising. So the two main ways we've done that is by utilizing recall training, which we've already started doing in our VIP area to motivate our penguins to come over for their medication and their daily vitamins. But we utilized it for feeding in the water as well, both to let them know it's time to eat, but also to get them moving. So we were able to do end-to-end swimming. So in our colony, in our space, we do have two ends where you can see our penguins at the glass. So we've recalled them to each end back and forth until they've done a few reps so that they're really moving, showing that high speed swimming and showing those porpoising behaviors. But we wanted to add an opportunity that wasn't just during feeds to get them moving. So we also utilized enrichment like our laser pointers to encourage them moving outside of just feeding time when perhaps they're not as motivated to move during feeding time, or if it's just a nice time for our visitors as well. And in this video here, this is an example of this training. So this is us doing our end-to-end recall. So we have a keeper at each end, whistling, and the penguins will then go from end to end and showing that really cool porpoising and high-speed swimming behavior, especially as a whole colony. So when we've looked at the changes that we've made over the past few years and the data that we've collected as well, we found that what we changed is working, and we're really pleased by the results overall in our colony. But it's not as significant as you might think when we think about the weight and body condition scores. So the average difference of the post-molt weights is only about 60 grams less than the previous year, but we have had some really good changes in the body condition scores overall. But we recognize and deliberately wanted this to be a slow process. We don't want to make significant or drastic changes for our animals in a short time. We want to be making slow, conscious, and deliberate decisions to be influencing the long-term welfare of the animals in our care. But the nice thing as well is that not all of the penguins are actually experiencing weight loss. However, the key ones that we want to lose weight and to reduce their body condition are losing the weight that they need to. So the table on the left is some of the individuals that were on our mobility or our Weight Watchers rounds, and we found that nearly all of them have lost weight and are in a much better position going into this year than they were last year. So we're really, really pleased by that overall.